And welcome to this fantastic session. I'm looking forward to speaking with Bronwyn Weir. I've got a bit of a girl crush on her in terms of what she brings to the industry and her level of obviously intelligence around construction and apartments. And of course, some would say infamous, some would say renowned report, which was the Shergold and Weir Report, which obviously catalysts, I think, action within Australia. And I am a admirer of anyone who does that. So I've invited Bronwyn to come back today to join us to talk about 2.5 years on from that Shergold and Weir Report, and of course the ABCB report that came out in December, and just how each state is kind of tracking against that. I've seen the slides. I'm excited. So welcome, Bronwyn. Thank you very much for being a guest of Australian Apartment Advocacy.
Thank you very much, Sam, for having me today, and to your organisation, Australian Apartment Advocacy, for asking me to speak. I have got some slides there. I just want to check that you guys can see them.
Yes, we do.
How does that look? Have you got them on the slideshow?
Yes.
All good, great. All right, so hopefully I'm going to speak over the next 30 minutes or so about where we're at across the country on what's happened since February 2018. It's actually 4 years, Sam, since we released the report. It's about 2.5 since the ABCB's implementation team began their work, which of course completed in December, as you mentioned. I'm also going to talk a little bit about that model guidance, and then I'll go through the progress, both at a high level and also state by state.
Now, Bronwyn, may I quickly, please, if I could, intervene? So if anyone has questions, please, could you see that there's a chat button down the bottom of your screen? If you could actually then please obviously write your questions in there, that would be fantastic. And we can then obviously answer those at the end of the presentation from Bronwyn. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sam. So the catalysts for our report were the cladding fires. So after the La Crosse fire in 2014, there was quite a bit of interest from government, some more than others, around this potential risk and the extent of risk that perhaps was in the market as a result of combustible cladding, because of course there was some quite concerned people after La Crosse. It really wasn't though until the Grenfell fire in 2017 that the ministers collectively decided that this was a symptom of a systemic problem in the industry, and they commissioned a report from Peter Shergold and I to advise them on the assessment of the effectiveness of compliant and enforcement systems, and to give them a roadmap, if you like, on how to improve compliance with the National Construction Code. So we had terms of reference, as you do with these sorts of reviews. They were broad, but also able to be ring-fenced into our report, which was provided to the ministers in February 2018 and published in April 2018. Our report was published just before the Hackett report in the UK. Dame Judith Hackett had similar terms of reference to ours, although hers were quite a bit broader in the sense that they included also asking her to look at the post-construction phase, which we weren't looking at under our terms of reference. But nevertheless, that report has almost been done parallel, and it's, whilst we're not discussing the UK reforms in this presentation today, certainly something that I've been watching closely, and you'll see also the relevance of that given the connection between the review in Victoria and Dame Judith Hackett. Not a great deal happened after our report was issued, really, until the Opal Towers crisis hit the press, which was around Christmas time in 2018. So several months after our report was published, there had been some coming together of the ministers, and industry groups were starting to sit up and take notice of our report, and pleasingly were very consistent in their support of our recommendations, and they had met with the ministers in these intervening months. But of course the media interest in Opal Tower was global, and it happened to occur in a matter of months before the New South Wales government election, which crystallised the thinking of that government on how it would tackle these problems. And of course, the Opal Tower tragedy was related to structural defect, as opposed to the cladding issues that had precipitated our report. A few months after that, of course, there was then the Mascot Tower residents having to leave their apartment, which was a 10-year-old apartment, again, and as a result of structural concern. And you know, between these two rather high-profile events, there was a number of other reports coming through the media over those months around problems with PI insurance, problems with the voluntary code mark certification scheme and the withdrawal of certificates relating to cladding products, and a range of other issues. And we had Premier Barajiklian from New South Wales coming out and saying, you know, it's not working, we need to reform the system. And as I say, New South Wales is really the epicentre of interest and political action, although all the states and territories were really concerned about the loss of confidence in the industry that was becoming quite apparent. Just ahead of a building ministers meeting in the middle of 2019, the 5 industry groups that you see there came together and launched a media campaign insisting that the building ministers needed to urgently reform building regulation in Australia, and in doing so implement our recommendations from the BCR report. And that media campaign was just days before the building ministers were meeting in Sydney. And they did respond to that pressure from industry, and struck a deal the night before their meeting to establish the ABCB's building confidence report implementation team. And so that was a pretty magnificent week in terms of the response to the building confidence report, because all the ministers agreed in principle not just to implement our recommendations, but to do so in a nationally consistent way through the appointment of the ABCB to establish frameworks for the implementation of our recommendations. So, you know, that sentence at the bottom of the slide there is what the ministers actually requested of the ABCB team. And you can see there in the graphic the governance that was set up around this work. The implementation team took advice from an expert panel. I was one of 6 people on that panel, as well as an industry leaders group represented by various industry associations. In addition to that, they issued, I think, around 26 discussion papers. And, you know, the industry and other stakeholders, each of the governments, engaged extensively over that 2-year period of this work in those discussion papers and putting submissions in to enable the BCR team to produce what I would consider is to be an exceptionally high quality package of frameworks, guidance material for each of the states and territories to use as part of their policy development and implementation of our recommendations. And if they move forward on those, you know, we will see a level of harmonisation that we haven't seen in building regulations. So fingers crossed that this work continues. The completed work of the ABCB's team includes 19 outputs, and I've got a link there to the website, but if you Google ABCB BCR, you'll easily find this webpage. They divided the outputs into these 6 categories that you can see on the screen there. And in between the sort of tram tracks there, you can see the various names of the documents that were produced as part of the outputs. There are various frameworks which set out principles that should be enshrined in legislation. In the case of a code of conduct for building surveyors, there's a national model there. There's also a national model code of conduct for fire safety engineers, which came out as part of recommendation 8. And, you know, various other sort of documents which guide how these recommendations should be implemented. The package is extensive. It's over 700 pages of material because in addition to the frameworks or key principles, there is also quite a bit of commentary explaining the recommendations and the approach to the development of these guidelines and frameworks. So it is really quite an extraordinary body of work for the governments to use going forward as they consider which reforms they will implement. The other thing that the BCR team did was very early on, actually, although it wasn't published until December, they went to the CIE to do a cost-benefit analysis of the case for implementation of the BCR recommendations. It was high level and necessarily high level, but they concluded that the BCR recommendations, if implemented, would prevent or deal with $2.5 billion worth of defects, 1.3 of those in the Class 2 apartment sector. They also said the cost to implement, that there'd be an initial cost of $121 million plus annual costs of $712. So in essence, they said that for every dollar spent on implementing the BCR, there'd be effectively $3 returned in terms of the benefits to the community. So let's move now to the progress by each government, and I'll start with the high-level analysis. So looking at, what's going on across the jurisdictions, and then I'll move into a jurisdiction by jurisdiction highlights. So what I want to touch on first is, there has been some delays in implementation, and in some cases, it seems to be a very slow process, remembering that it is now 4 years since the report was published. So I think this stems from a number of things, and the first one is that some jurisdictions possibly think they've met some of the recommendations when they haven't. So the only published, self-assessment that's been made by the states and territories was done back in 2019, not long after the Opal Towers issue arose. And that was, as I say, the self-assessment. And so each state and territory put forward the recommendations that they thought they already met, or partially met, or, intended to meet, or accepted. So there was these, acronyms that they used to do a somewhat consistent assessment, and each of them spoke about recent reforms and their approach to reforming building regulations in their jurisdiction. And so that now is quite old in terms of that self-assessment. There's been no commitment for any other reporting, notwithstanding that one of our recommendations was that the states and territories report on their implementation of our recommendations at least annually. That hasn't occurred, and as far as I'm aware, there's no commitment to doing that at this point. There seems to be, I think, potentially a lack of transparency about which recs might be implemented, or recommendations that, in fact, governments have decided they don't want to pursue. There's quite vague language around things that are under consideration and so forth. And I guess really this also stems from this lack of reporting, whether it be self-reporting or independent assessment of what states and territories have done with our recommendations. There's also been, quite a bit of activity. So notwithstanding the fact that most of our recommendations have not been implemented by most jurisdictions, there has been activity in states and territories, and in some cases the policy priorities have been on things outside of our recommendations. So, for example, cladding has occupied a lot of energy of the governments, which has sometimes required legislative reform. There have been other policies in Victoria, for example, trades registration was introduced a few years ago now, but the implementation of it has been quite slow, but it is, taking up change in the industry for things like introduction of trades registration really does use up that tolerance that industry have for change. And, one of the biggest, frustrations that I hear when I go to conferences from all aspects of the industry is the pace of change and how difficult it is to keep up with change. And when you've got businesses operating across jurisdictions and they're having to watch different governments introduce different reforms, as well as, of course, NCC reforms coming in over the top of that, it does become quite challenging for businesses to keep up. And so I think governments are conscious of that, and in some cases, they're prioritising their response to BCR around other policy priorities like their cladding response or security of payment reforms, of which there's been, significant changes in the Western Australia recently, but also around consumer protection. And the BCR didn't look at consumer protection issues, but nevertheless, of course, some governments have been focusing on that and introducing reforms around consumer protection in priority to our BCR reforms. We've also seen the governments conducting their own reviews. So Victoria has an expert panel that's now been in place for over 2 years, conducting a systemic review of building regulations. We've had parliamentary inquiries in the ACT as well as the New South Wales government, and they've been conducted over a number of years. And then there's also currently a panel appointed in Queensland looking at the role of developers and various other sort of consultation processes that governments have chosen to proceed with in advance of or as an alternative to proceeding with straight to implementation. And I'm pleased to say that in all of the cases I'm aware of, that those panels have been very supportive of the BCR recommendations and said they should be implemented. So whilst that's a good thing, having these other reviews is delaying the implementation going forward. I think it's also fair to say that governments would say they've been waiting for the ABCB to finish their work and participating in that process, and that's a valid reason to wait for implementation. And hopefully now that material is there and has been published since December, that will allow them to move forward more quickly. I think the other point to mention here is around the potential cost to government from some of these reforms. Some of our jurisdictions have quite, I would say, poor funding models for their regulators or for local government and its role in the regulation of the building system. And so, imposing potentially increased powers and functions or setting up proactive auditing programs by government costs money. It requires capacity within government and technical capability, which may not necessarily exist in all jurisdictions, but also a commitment to fund those activities. So I do think that, reading between the lines, some of the hesitation to move forward on some of our recommendations might be around these underlying issues around how the regulators are funded or inadequately funded in these states, and the willingness to look at those funding models and potentially pass through costs to the industry, which of course is politically sensitive, at the best of times. Now
Bronwyn, I'm just going to interrupt you. So if you were in charge of reviewing legislation as a result of your report and obviously the subsequent reviews that have been held, what would your timely response be? What do you think would be an appropriate time to have actually got some? Because we've seen some of the states trump ahead and we've seen some that kind of like are still holding back. What's your ideal time?
Well, Peter and I said in our report that all of the recommendations should be implemented in 3 years. So I guess, and we also said that an implementation panel or team should be set up immediately to assist with that process. Now, it took about 18 months for that BCR team to be stood up. So, there was a bit of a delay in getting it going. And then the work of that team took 2.5 years in total, and they worked at a good pace. So I don't have any criticism of that. But I guess, because they didn't commence that work for 18 months after our report was given to them, they really were a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of meeting that 3-year time frame that we put in our report. So we are now 4 years on, but as I said, that ABCB work has only been completed last year. And interestingly, the CIE report that I mentioned, the figures that it has put forward in terms of the cost-benefit analysis assume that all of the recommendations will be in place across the country in 2022, which of course seems highly unlikely at this point. So those costs and impacts and benefits will, of course, change over time. And what we've seen, of course, in the last 6 to 12 months is a massive increase in the cost of building work and materials and supplies and other things. So, you know, those figures from the CIA report become outdated quite quickly. So we certainly put a challenge to the governments to move on this work quickly. And we were also very clear that we said all of our recommendations were intertwined and needed to be introduced as a package. So the idea of cherry picking certain recommendations and not going through with others will mean there hasn't been full implementation, and the effectiveness of what we propose won't be achieved. So it's all right to say that there needs to be staged implementation and industry has to have an opportunity for those transitions and adjustments. But, you know, it still begs the question as to what won't be done and, you know, where are the priorities, and there's a real lack of transparency presently around that. Just moving on, there was no sort of easy way to put up this next slide, so there's a lot of information, but I'll talk through all these next couple of slides. I've tried here to identify each of the recs briefly and also give some high-level comments of an assessment across the jurisdictions. So Recs 1 and 2, which was about creating a nationally consistent registration framework, which is represented by the National Registration Framework that's been produced by the ABCB, is really the response to Recs 1 and 2. And Rec 2 in particular talks about this being nationally consistent. So in fact, no single jurisdiction can comply with this on their own. In order for this recommendation to be met, all jurisdictions would need to implement the National Registration Framework. We do have some jurisdictions with quite comprehensive frameworks that have most, or in the case of Queensland, all of the categories that we recommended and that are covered in the NRF. But what we haven't seen is those jurisdictions go back to the NRF and compare their entry requirements for each of those categories of registration and the experience requirements and the other elements in the NRF, and make sure that their schemes match. And I've not heard of, well, certainly in Victoria, the expert panel, and in WA, I've heard them saying, yes, they're going to do that analysis, but we've not yet seen any government move forward and make those changes to its scheme to match the NRF. And what we've had come into the system, I guess, since our report, of course, is automatic mutual recognition, which is slowly being switched on around the country in the building sector. And, you know, the answer to properly implementing that automatic mutual recognition is the implementation of our National Registration Framework, which, you know, was developed in consultation with all these relevant stakeholders and represents that collective view. CPD, Tasmania is still the only jurisdiction that has CPD for all its building practitioners. Of course, some practitioners who are members of certain industry associations will be doing CPD through those memberships. So it's not that we have no CPD operating in the sector, but in terms of mandatory CPD as part of these registration schemes, Tasmania is the only jurisdiction that has implemented that recommendation. There's quite a bit of talk, and there does seem to be a commitment to it, but 4 years on, we haven't seen it being taken up as yet. New South Wales is making great progress, and I'll touch on that in more detail when I go through the jurisdictional analysis. Rec 4 is about career pathways for building certifiers and certifiers. And there has been some work. This is not a rec that is likely to have legislation. It is more about regulatory practice and government support for programs. And I'm certainly aware of new programs in Victoria, Tasmania and Queensland. There may be others. It's not always easy to find public information on some of these initiatives that aren't legislation based. I've bundled together Recs 5, 6, 7, 9 and 11, which really collectively are about better regulatory oversight of the industry, including sort of recalibrating or refreshing that role of a private certifier as a statutory officer, effectively doing a statutory function. There has been increased efforts in New South Wales and Victoria, and some recognition, I guess, should be given to Western Australia and Queensland around their strategies for this, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done in this space if we're going to properly regulate the industry, and including getting on building sites and pulling up defects before they occur and requiring rectification before those occupation certificates and the like are signed off. No changes yet in terms of the model guidance for the role of fire authorities, and I've not yet become aware of any state proposing to introduce the code of conduct for fire safety engineers, but hopefully that model now being there makes it easy for them to move forward with that one. Code of conduct for building certifiers. So a number of jurisdictions had one of these. My own view was that none of them really did enough in terms of providing, I guess, ethical standards and benchmarking the expected behaviour of building surveyors, not just for that profession, but for all of the other professions that interact with them. So each jurisdiction has either introduced or refreshed their code. And WA has a draft out. They're the last jurisdiction to introduce a code. The WA draft is almost identical to the model, national model. Each of the other states have done something slightly different, which doesn't bode well for consistent implementation, but nevertheless, we've seen quite a bit of work on this rec. Rec 12 is around centralised lodgement of building approval documents. So since BCR, we've seen the New South Wales, South Australia and Tasmania move forward with centralised platforms. All three of those jurisdictions off the back of their planning process lodgement as well. ACT and Northern Territory as territories without local government repositories for this information. We're already collecting that information at a government level. But so yeah, a bit of movement here. Notably though, there are still a few states off that list. Victoria does collect some centralised information, but not the permit approval documents. 14 and 15 around the use of performance. So the NCC has been adjusted to require written performance design briefs, and those ought to be being submitted with approval documents now, and that's been quite an adjustment for industry. 13 and 16 around tackling the D&C contracting model. Some movement to that in New South Wales. The ATC says their scheme does that, and you know that might be the case. Mandatory independent third-party review. Only the Northern Territory has introduced this, and that commenced in 1 January this year. And I'll talk about that when I go through the jurisdictional analysis. Mandatory inspections, particularly of complex buildings, so class 2 to 9 or class 2 in particular. A bit of talk about this, but I've seen no one really take up the framework that's been put out by the BCR implementation team. And it's an area where I really think we need to move towards much greater oversight during construction, not just by the building surveyor, but by engineers. And in the case of Rec 19, we say the fire safety engineer should be involved in those inspections. So really not a huge amount happening around Recs 18 and 19. In 19, we do have some elements of that in Queensland and New South Wales, and New South Wales says that they've got more coming in the next tranche of their reforms, which should come through this year. Building manual, lots of talk, no one's introduced it yet. I do think that's one that we will see come in over time. It does seem to be favoured and it's a bit of a no-brainer, but we just haven't seen that rubber hit the road on that one. And building product safety, so some amendments to the NCC around the requirements for evidence of suitability have been strengthened. I think a little bit more could be done on that in NCC, but nevertheless, anecdotally, I'm hearing that building surveyors and designers are much more demanding to see product information from manufacturers and putting a lot more pressure back on the product industry as gatekeepers. So that is a good shift, but we haven't done anywhere near as much as we need to do in terms of regulatory controls in this space. Queensland is the only state still with supply chain laws, which they introduced in 2017 prior to our report being released.
So Bronwyn, the Australian Apartment Advocacy is actually calling on a 100-day summit with the successful federal government to talk about exactly that thing, in terms of making sure that we're not importing materials that don't meet Australian standards, and that leave, you know, ultimately apartment owners with the cost of actually undertaking the repairs, especially when the builder goes Phoenix.
Yeah, it is a massive regulatory gap. There's a lot of movement on this in the UK as a result of the findings coming out of the Grenfell inquiry, which were really quite shocking and disgraceful. There's actually a seminar that I'm involved in tomorrow night through the International Building Quality Centre, talking about the issues in building product performance. And if anyone's interested in that, they can find the details on LinkedIn under my LinkedIn posts. So let's whip around the states and territories. Western Australia has put out 4 what they call consultation regulatory impact statements, so essentially discussion papers where they've explored some of the recommendations from the BCR. Apparently there is a 5th paper out very soon, which is going to discuss those recommendations that I've mentioned there on the slide. And that might then lead to some recommendations for reform in the next, I guess, 12 months in WA. So they're moving forward. They're certainly, you know, committed to policy reform, but very little in terms of actual legislative change in WA. There has been a decision by the Minister just recently that they will be registering engineers, but I'm told that might take 3 to 5 years to transition in. And of course, that's just one of the categories in the National Registration Framework that is missing in WA. So they still have not yet committed to a full alignment to the NRF. I've already mentioned the Code of Conduct. The other thing of note in WA is they've published a strategy for auditing, proactively auditing building sites. And I've mentioned here on the slide I guess the high level strategy there that's in the priorities document. So some class 1 work, a little bit of class 2. I think they've said around 24 inspections of balustrades of passive fire, so 50 in total. So there is at least a published strategy, which goes to recommendation 7 of our report. It's relatively light touch. I mean, as you can see there, they're looking at a couple of elements of construction on 50 or so buildings in the class sort of 2 space. It's better than nothing, and it's certainly worth a mention. And you know, any state that's moving forward with a transparent, proactive inspection program, I think, deserves some recognition for that. I don't even have to tell you what state we're talking about here. We all know this man who has been a revolutionary in terms of what he's doing in New South Wales. He is, in some ways, he's a critic of BCR, and certainly his agenda is much broader than BCR in terms of his priorities for his mandate there. He has a very strong authorising environment and an incredibly impressive social media profile. I believe that some of these recent posts, he's now achieving well in excess of 50, 60,000 hits on any of his posts, much more so than many of our prominent politicians around the country. He's really taken it by storm. And of course, you know, he doesn't, you know, he's not backward in coming forward, and, you know, in many ways he's quite entertaining in how direct he is with his comments. So there's a lot of information you can find about Construct New South Wales, which is the name for his plan. But particularly, I guess, for the purposes of this presentation, we've got the Design Building Practitioners Act, which touches on these 4 recommendations. It doesn't fully implement all of those. Rec 13 they do a pretty good job of, which is the declared designs. They've also registered designers, including engineers, through this bill, which was a big gap in terms of the New South Wales alignment to the BCR roadmap. And so there's now declared designs, as well as the builder having to make a declaration at the end of a project. Those designs are lodged into an electronic portal, which goes to Rec 12. And that bill also included some duty of care reforms, so around trying to strengthen consumer protection and make it easier to sue various building professionals in the process. The other big piece of legislation is the Residential Apartment Enforcement Powers Act, or the RAB Act, and this provides the Commissioner with powers to go onto existing buildings that are 6 years old and to building sites under construction. 133 audits commenced, 45 completed. I believe that the plan is to get to around 200 by the end of this year.
Right.
And these are deep dives into these buildings, so they get all of the documentation and spend quite some time on site doing inspections. And where they think it's appropriate, they can prevent the issuing of an occupancy certificate until defects are rectified. The objective, of course, making the developer accountable, catching them in the act, if you like, and making sure that it hits them where it hurts in terms of delaying those off the plan sales until the building is brought into compliance. So there's some stats on the activity under this Act. 30 developments have received orders, some of them more than one, and they've certainly been very, very active, including with that very powerful media presence. Other things of note in New South Wales, a new certified practice standard. So they have a code of conduct there already, but they produce this much more lengthy document, which applies to the conduct of certifiers. They also have created courses, 2-hour micro-credentials through New South Wales TAFE, and they've had over 28,000 enrolments to do those courses. They include not just a training element, but an assessment at the end of the 2-hour course, which must be passed at a 70% pass rate. And you have 3 opportunities to do the assessment to pass the course. So the content there is what's really, quite impressive. Anyone can tune into this. You don't have to be a building practitioner in New South Wales. It costs about $180 to do a course. They've covered things like waterproofing, site safety, holistic design. There are some that are quite specific to complying with the Design Practitioner Act as well, but there's plenty of content there for practitioners across the country to be interested in. Huge program around digital transformation. So some of that is around that lodgement of documents, but also some market-driven initiatives that David has been heavily backing. So the iCert rating scheme for developers and builders, and the Building Assurance Scheme platform, which is under development as well. And there's also a panel that they're looking at the introduction of site-specific decennial insurance.
Sorry, I do interject here now and then, Bronwyn. So, but it's also that 2% building bond, right? That's been a bit of a game changer, hasn't it? Right.
So that was introduced before BCR, and it is obviously a consumer protection mechanism there. So that's certainly been introduced and is in place. And I think it's probably early days to say whether or not that's making a big difference. And it does really, it's part of what is quite a unique scheme in New South Wales. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see whether that improves things in terms of defect management. I've got some points up here, which I actually took from a presentation that David did to the Property Council a week or 2 ago. So this is from the horse's mouth in terms of the legislation that's coming through in the next tranche. They are creating a Building Act in New South Wales for the first time, which might seem unusual to most other jurisdictions that already have one. And they are expanding their design building practitioner scheme to Class 3 and 9Cs. They're bringing in some of those fire safety system reforms which relate to Rec 19, and they're also introducing some regulation around prefabricated and modular buildings. Victoria, a number of changes since 2018 when our report came out, but zero in terms of actually implementing VCR in a legislative sense. Having said that, the VBA has, I think, been quite impressive in terms of its improvements to regulatory practice. It is now publishing reports on its activities around compliance. It inspects over 12,000 buildings a year. So if we think about WA, New South Wales and Victoria in terms of their published strategies around the on-site inspections, we've got, a little toe in the water in WA, 200 odd inspections by the end of the year in New South Wales, but quite deep dives into Class 2 only building. Victoria's got a different approach. They're doing over 12,000 inspections, but, more than 90% of those are in the Class 1 space. There is a big chunk in the Class 2 to 9 space. And this is partly because of the directive from the Minister is to inspect 10% of permits that are issued. And so that equates to over 12,000 permits a year, which is a massive program. But they are publishing their reports on that. My feedback from industry is that that's really helpful, and that sort of education feedback loop is starting to produce some pretty good proactive outcomes there. They've also just published a report on the audit of building surveyors, which is a desktop audit of documents approved, which says that there's still quite some issues with the quality of documentation. They've got a monthly education program that the VBA has with over 10,000 attendees. So, you know, you can see some similarities with what New South Wales is doing. But, you know, Victoria's doing the same but different, and in different sort of volumes and different approaches. So, you know, but I do think that there's been a massive shift in terms of the regulatory practice activities of the VBA, which I do know are responsive to the BCR Recs 5, 6 and 7, for example, in terms of, you know, regulating better in Victoria. And they introduced a code of conduct, which actually anecdotally has shifted quite a few business practices that were, you know, arguably inappropriate previously. There is an expert panel, as I mentioned, and here's the connection back to the UK, because Dame Judith Hackett is one of the 6 panel members that is on this review. They've been in place for a couple of years. They say that they will enhance the registration scheme and align it to NRF, but the timing of that seems to be, you know, quite long-term. Supports to increase building surveyor numbers. They have indicated that they will be recommending at some point that some elements of the building approvals process be put back to local government. Now, what that means is unclear at the moment, but the principle seems to be quite clear in terms of the expert panel and the information they have given to the industry at a recent conference, that they will be bringing local government back into the process for Class 2 buildings. And also looking at third-party review and mandatory inspection, so our Rec 17, 18 and 19 there. Boosting the role of local government to support this pushback of permits into local government, so providing greater accountability for local government. This one I think is really important. I'm not seeing anyone else in Australia really have a look at trying to unpack this issue of local government participation in the regulation of these schemes and trying to reinvigorate effective enforcement by councils, and so, you know, this is some really good work going on by the expert panel, and they're introducing a new consumer protection body, and they're very interested in improving data collection and the building manual. Queensland created a Safer Buildings Task Force, which had a dual role of looking at combustible cladding rectification as well as VCR implementation. There's a link to some of their work. There's also a Queensland Building Plan, which was recently updated, which you can find here. And that covers things like BCR implementation, but also broader policy reform initiatives from the Queensland Government. They are reviewing QBCC at the moment, as well as the role of developers. The QBCC review was due to be published in April, so it seems to be imminent. And a new commissioner there has been appointed, Anissa Levy. So a bit of activity going on in Queensland. They did make some reforms to the Act and regs to, I guess, align to some of our recommendations that they didn't quite meet from a legislative point of view. So that was quite deliberate, I guess, reforms that were responsive to BCR and tidying up some of their alignment with our recommendations. They've refreshed their code of conduct. They are moving towards mandatory CPD with a bit of a toe in the water there, and did a pilot program last year. I'm not sure when that will come forward. Refresh their fire protection licensing scheme, but largely the reforms in Queensland over the last couple of years have been around security of payment, including the introduction of project bank accounts. So this is an example where their appetite for reform priority has been given to these financial viability issues in Queensland. Having said that, they were probably one of two jurisdictions that met most of the recommendations that we made back in 2018, so didn't have as much work to do to bridge that gap. South Australia has been very focused on planning reform and completely overhauled their legislation. They have introduced a new policy for inspecting buildings. Notably, they now will have local government inspecting 90% of Class 2 to 9 buildings, but only with one inspection, which, you know, is something, I guess, better than nothing, but not a lot of oversight. A new requirement to have a certificate of occupancy for Class 1s and electronic lodgement of building material really commencing only in recent months through these plans South Australia. Tasmania is the only jurisdiction that has got compulsory CPD through their registration scheme. They have made some minor changes. They, along with Queensland, were one of the jurisdictions that were didn't have as much work to do to meet all of our recommendations. And they have introduced these electronic lodgement so centralised lodgement of building approvals responding to Rec 12. So they're the major sort of, I guess, points to make about Tassie. ACT, so they had a parliamentary inquiry which spanned our report and went for a couple of years there. They did make some reforms in 2019 and introduced a code of practice and also something similar for builders back in June 2020, guidelines for good practice for builders and for minimum documentation. They announced a couple of years ago now that private certification would no longer be an option for complex multi-unit buildings, so bringing it back into government away from private certification. So the second jurisdiction, or they were the first actually, Victoria being the second, to signal this shift back away from private certification. And they've also said they'll register developers, but we're yet to see what that looks like. They've strengthened their registration scheme and they were already collecting information centrally. And last but not least, Northern Territory. So they made some policy announcements in March last year for the introduction of third-party review. This was off the back of an engineer in New South Wales that was found responsible for some significant engineering failures in Class 2. I think there were 8 or 9 Class 2 multi-storey buildings that were found to be significantly structurally inadequate. And so they've been focused on that particular issue. They say they'll introduce mandatory CPD. They say they're going to register commercial builders in the territory and increase penalties, and also at that last dot point around improving that regulatory oversight capacity. So the independent third-party review is really their major sort of first mover on our Rec 4, Rec 17 there. It commenced this year. It's for significant and complex buildings, and there's some documents that they've released which explain what that is and when this is triggered. And the reviews are of structural engineering by a Northern Territory registered certifying engineer who's got to have a minimum 10 years experience. So that's quite you know, something of note in the Northern Territory, that they're the first to introduce this mandatory third-party review of structural engineering.
That's good.
There we go. I don't know how I'm going for time, Sam, but hopefully
we're doing well.
For questions.
What I'll do is I'll get you to stop sharing your screen, please, Bronwyn, because then I will share my screen myself, because I do have like a couple of slides at the end. So for me, what's your take away from this? Like, what would you, if I was to ask you, and this is very cheeky of me to ask you, but if you were going to kind of like rank your states from number 1 being the best to number 5 needing a bit of a kick up the backside, what would you say?
Well, yeah, I'm kind of reluctant to be drawn into that. I think you can see from what I've presented to you that we've had some states which have introduced legislation that is directly responsive to our report, and that's Queensland, New South Wales. They haven't necessarily implemented every recommendation in those states. And I think particularly what I'd say about Queensland is that whilst they have a legislative framework that is very closely aligned to BCR. I do still think that they've got gaps in terms of the regulatory oversight, how they work with local government. The role of the private certifier in Queensland is slightly different than in other states. And whilst they've sought to sort of shift that role a bit more towards what we said in Recs 9, 10 and 11 about private building surveyors, they're still, not quite there. So I think, and Tassie already ticked a lot of boxes, but again, how effective are they regulating the system? We've seen a lot of media out of Tassie pre-Christmas around some pretty distressed homeowners. And so I don't think they've necessarily got it all under control down there, even though you can go through this academic exercise of, which recs do you meet? I think there are some that are a real challenge for governments in terms of, good regulatory oversight, good practice, the role of local government and around those recs 5, 6 and 7. And, the standouts for those would be New South Wales with David Chandler's efforts, of course, and as I said, Victoria making some real inroads into being more effective. So, I'm a little disappointed with the pace of change in places like Victoria. Whilst they've got, this expert panel there, there's 2 years. We haven't yet seen a bill passed that is directly responsive to BCR changes, which is a bit of a shame. WA, similarly, great to be putting out discussion papers and other things, but very little movement in terms of actual reform coming through. And, for South Australia, it's really hard to see anywhere publicly where they stand on BCR and, whether they're proposing to make any changes. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I don't want to put the wind out of anyone's sails because no. I am sure that all the jurisdictions are taking this seriously. It's just very hard to understand why it's taking so long. And, I'm not even necessarily, we can see Northern Territory's made some policy statements and presumably will follow through with Ledge soon. But yeah, this sort of process can be very drawn out and it would be great if it was given a bit more priority.
I agree with you 100%. Okay. And I think for us, we're looking at situations where we even just were recently speaking to a major LGA in the East Coast, and they said, we're not like New South Wales. We don't have mascot towers and Eiffel towers here.
Yeah, well, that's quite concerning because we do seem to need to have it on our doorstep for us to take notice. And, even what's come out of the Grenfell public inquiry resonates with what's going on in Australia in terms of the, myriad of systemic failures and behaviours. And, it's all very easy for governments to say, well, that's happening in another jurisdiction, or that parliamentary inquiry was for the ACT or for, that state. These issues resonate, and that's why our report has resonated. And, there may be some differences in compliance rates across different jurisdictions, but we just don't know for sure. And there's nothing to say that what David Chandler's found in New South Wales isn't also happening in other jurisdictions and not being identified and rectified. So it would be great to have a bit more comparative data, some reliable data, but we don't have that, and we ought to have it. And that's, work that would be great to have. And I know your association has sought to gather some of that data as well.
Yeah, well, of course, because for us, it's the concept we don't want apartment owners to have, defect debt, basically. And so for us, it's important that the build quality is done, to a standard. And, you could argue that self-certification was the death knell, right, in terms of quality within Australian construction. And for half of the ABCB report with regards to defects in construction to be attributed to apartments, and still we're not taking it seriously, I don't know what it's going to require because, like you, Bronwyn, I'm also frustrated.
Yeah, well, and New South Wales is a real standout in the sense that its reforms have focused heavily on Class 2. And, we've seen Victoria talking about making a change to the building approvals process for Class 2, but, I'm not sure when we'll see that, and the nature of it is still yet to be disclosed.
Yeah.
And the same with ACT. They've announced that they're going to bring the oversight back into government for these multi-unit buildings. So it's all talk though, and you know, with the exception of New South Wales, we haven't seen a lot of action around focusing in on Class 2, improving the integrity of the approvals process, improving the oversight and, you know, proactive inspections by government of those types of buildings. We've seen very little action on that. So, you know, that's quite disappointing, because even if it takes a long time for legislation to be introduced, that doesn't prevent regulators from actually standing up and moving forward with a program for proactive oversight of the Class 2 sector. Obviously, they need funding for that, which is not something that comes easily. But nevertheless, you know, Queensland, for example, has quite a large inspection team and have for many years done large numbers of inspections, but they've been very focused on their, you know, to complement the warranty insurance scheme that they operate. So, you know, the below 3 stories or the Class 1s, which is all very well, but I've not seen any shift up there in that program towards these higher risk Class 2 buildings. So, you know, that's a bit of a shame, and it would be great to see a bit more movement towards recognising that risk and government really investing in oversight of that sector to try to shift some of the practices that we know are occurring.
So John Breers has actually asked a question, and he knows that I'm already actually going to also concur with this. So he said, what do you think about requiring annual inspections of apartment buildings to be mandatory? Now, before you say, Bronwyn, what you're going to say, for me, I think we've advocated this all along, because, you know, latent defects, as you know, can take 2 or 3 years before they come to fruition. That stalactite growing from your car park is not a good thing. And so, you know, the annual inspections does allow you, especially with some jurisdictions having only 6 years to claim, you know, the defect warranty. It's important, right, to be proactive rather than to actually, you know, kind of like wait for disaster.
Well, yeah, and in an apartment building, it's not easy for the average lot owner to firstly understand what a defect might be, and secondly identify it because of just the nature of ownership of these buildings. So look, I think what you raise is really goes to the issue of post-construction and how do we regulate and oversee that. And we didn't look at that in BCR because we were asked to look at the implementation of NCC. NCC doesn't have any post-construction requirements in it, but naturally, of course, you want compliance not just to be there on the date of OP, but to be in place for the life of the building. And our scheme around Australia around post-construction obligations is very thin. Most jurisdictions have some requirements around essential safety measures or fire safety measures, and they vary in terms of whether that's occurring in a very effective way. But in terms of, you know, broader inspections of buildings and defect identification and so forth, there really is nothing in place for that, and it becomes, you know, up to the owners. In New South Wales, I know that the very common practice is that even at the first AGM, a lawyer might be present and a recommendation made to appoint a defects consultant to start trawling the building as early as that first AGM. So, you know, that's not necessarily a good thing, Sam.
Well, no, Bronwyn, we don't want to see any kind of concern around those kinds of defects, because you're right about a crisis in confidence. And, you know, I know there's a crying out from some developers to actually be seen as being ethical and good quality, and hence, you know, David's Equifax iCert program, which of course they have to basically do once they get to that 6 months out from practical completion. And nothing like holding a nice heavy steel bar to get, I guess, you know, people to actually conform. But, you know, we are seeing some states take leadership, and then we're seeing other states where we are calling them toothless. And, you know, I spoke to Anissa Levy the other day and I said to her, your inspectors are taking 18 months to get out. And in that stage, most often the body corporates decide to actually go ahead and fix the defects, because they're fearful that if they actually take one step towards any kind of QCAT, you know, the builder will Phoenix and then they're gone. right? So,
yeah, well, I mean, the other kind of complicating factor with this, and one of the issues that David Chandler has raised, is the fact that owners corporations don't necessarily want to make a big fuss about defects because that might affect the value of their building, and you know, there becomes this sort of issue and this potential that some owners will want to sell out of the property knowing there are problems without, you know, clear transparency to the purchaser. And so this is a very complicated area, and you know, this the fact that they don't come forward necessarily, because governments don't necessarily have these dispute resolution schemes available for buildings over 3 stories, and so governments might be excused for saying they don't really understand the extent of the problem because people don't come to them. But I think that that's a little naive. We know that there's a massive issue in the Class 2 sector, and it would be great to have some more data. And of course, we had the Deakin University report and the New South Wales report that came out last year, which really honed in on the lack of information about this, and the work that your organisation has done to try to root this problem out. So, you know, on the one hand, governments might be able to say, well, you know, we don't know about this, but on the other hand, I think the evidence is just unequivocal.
That's a perfect way to finish that conversation, Bronwyn. So I'm actually going to say thank you to everybody who's attended today. I hope that you have found it as informative, because there's a lot of data that's gone into that, Bronwyn, and a lot of time and effort. So I'm very grateful. So thank you for that. Keep posting what you're posting, because I always read your posts. They're always worthwhile reading in terms of the timeliness of what's happening. And we do want to see more protection. And I think that's where we're united, right? And we do want to also make sure that build quality continues to improve rather than actually not. So I'm going to say thank you, everyone, for attending tonight. We are recording the session, and we will actually then issue that to you so that you can actually get a copy of that. But I'm going to say good night, and thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Bronwyn. It was very much appreciated.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.